I will explain a little bit about the way in which I approach breathing with a singer, and my general approach in all aspects of vocal pedagogy is to take the information that we've learned from voice science, put it in the hopper together with information from great singers, the way they express the workings of their own instrument, and see what kind of consensus evolves from that. I almost always try to explain the findings of voice science in a very simple fashion. Many singing students are not adept at acoustics or anatomy, and some are even squeamish at looking at pictures of anatomy. So while it's important for the voice teacher to know voice science thoroughly, it's not important that the singer knows exactly the name of every muscle and how it works. So when a new student comes, we usually start with breathing because we have a tripartite system that has evolved, a tripartite organ. We have a power supply in the heart and the lungs. We have a vibrator in the larynx, and we have a resonator in the vocal tract. And as simple as that sounds, that encompasses about 1,000,000 years of evolution. So in breathing for the average person and breathing for speech, takes a very shallow breath and gets rid of it in a hurry. We breathe about every 2.5 seconds we take a new breath in speech. So obviously breathing for singing is going to have to differ remarkably than in singing than it does for speech. Some of the phrases that we sing are going to be 10 to 15 seconds. So obviously there's going to have to be a big difference. The reason that we take a breath for speech about every 2.5 seconds is because we take a very shallow breath. And so the first thing then is to acquaint the young student with the mechanism for inhalation, because the oft-mentioned diaphragm is scarcely used in breathing for speech. In fact, most people do not use it at all. It just sits there in the rib cage without much activity in a normal breath for speech. So breathing for singing is already going to have to require the student to activate certain musculature that they have been unaware of as a speaker. Now, I don't know how much I can get involved here in the evolution of the organ, but it represented a major, major evolution when we developed a connection between the respiratory system and the phonatory system. When our primate brothers do hoo, 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 each of those hoots is a separate puff of air. The chimpanzee cannot sing in a line. The remarkability in our evolution was the development of a neural connection, and with it a cortical system in the right brain, a neural connection between the respiratory system and the phonatory system, so that we could make many different sounds on one breath and many different pitches. So we literally evolved in that sense as a singing primate. This was long before speech. Speech is very recent in human history. Regardless of which expert we choose to follow, speech doesn't come along until at the very earliest about 100,000 years ago, and that's at the earliest possibility. So the organs that we use were long developed by evolution before that, and therefore they were evolved for something other than speech. And the breath which invigorated the organ for its primary function of making sounds is much different than the breath which later became used for speech. So speech made use of a grand organ which was already evolved for much grander purposes of noise making. So as soon as hominids became tribal and found the benefits in living in community, the necessity for making noises in an imitative fashion for communication was essential for survival. All of those sounds that were imitative of the savannas on which we evolved, utilized the organ in a position and in effectivity the way we have cultured it now as singing. So our singing is essentially a usage of the primitive function of the organ. Now that doesn't mean that you can go out and do jungle imitative sounds and learn to sing, but it does. I'm trying to point out there's a connection between how we breathe and how the organ of singing works. So the first thing we do is we get the young singer to breathe deeply, to feel the diaphragm. Now the diaphragm is not consciously controllable. It's underneath the seat of consciousness. You can't just command it to contract. And so you have to teach the student how to indirectly get the diaphragm to work and what it feels like when it's working. So if you follow the sternum with your thumb until you find the end of the sternum, and then with your little finger place it on the belly button, you have discovered the epigastric umbilical region. If the diaphragm contracts, the epigastric umbilical region moves outward slightly. If there is no outward movement there, the diaphragm is not contracting. In the flanks, on the sides of the rib cage, that area moves out even further than the epigastrial, than the epigastric umbilical area moves forward. So the sides move out and the tummy moves out a little bit too. Those are the signs of the diaphragm working. The intercostal muscles in the rib cage also expand the rib cage, and together we have then a set of inhalation muscles, or what Lamperti called respiratory muscles. Those muscles, as important as they are, bring in a large amount of air into the lungs in a very short amount of time if the mouth is open. So most singers learn to breathe through the mouth and to sing through the mouth. The nose is perfectly fine if you wish to inhale through the nose, but it will take about 2.5 seconds to get a full breath. Most of the time in singing, we do not have 2.5 seconds in between breaths. So instead, we learn to relax the jaw, let the diaphragm work, and air moves very quickly into the lungs and into a much fuller capacity. The next question is always how much air the singer should have in the lungs. And I have found that most singers under-inhale. And perhaps it is a failure of some teachers. We have often used the phrase that you should inhale as though you're inhaling a beautiful rose. Well, that might be fine if you inhaled a bouquet of roses, but to inhale one beautiful rose, you're not going to get close to the vital capacity in the lungs. And we want to sing with close to the vital capacity in the lungs. The lungs have resilience and elasticity to them, so that the more air that you put into them, the more recoil force there is to get rid of the air. Now we have to balance that recoil force by continued contraction of the inhalation muscles. That point of balance is what is historically called la lotta vocale, which means that we sing on the inhalation, that the voice is not a blowing instrument. Instead, most of the air remains in compression in the lungs, while only a relative small amount is used to incur vibration in the vocal folds. In that regard, it's similar in some respects to the bagpipes. The bags have to be full of air before the pipes work. If the bags go down, the pipes don't blow. So we sometimes use a spirometer to gauge both the vital capacity and the full capacity of the individual's lungs. And we try then to let them experience what it feels like when they get a breath which is close to vital capacity. The whole history of la lotta vocale, which Lamperti begins to give us at the beginning of the 1800s, shows a history of historic pedagogy in which the proper balance of the tone is discovered by maintenance of the inhalation contraction within those muscles. So we try to allow the young singer to experience what it feels like when the inhalation muscles contract. And then we ask them to try to maintain that as long as comfortably possible during the singing phrase. That is, the two groups of muscles, inhalation and exhalation, oppose one another, and we are trying, la lotta vocale, the vocal contest, we're trying to keep the exhalation muscles from coming in to work. Instead, we're trying to engage to continue the action of the inhalation muscles through the vocal phrase. And that means that the epigastric umbilical area will stay outward positioned, the flanks will stay outward, the sternum will stay up until the very, very last of a long phrase, in which time it will move in, so preparing for the next breath. So this is the basic setup that is known as appoggio, which is a system I teach. There are other positions of the body which are not associated with appoggio, but which are often taught. It is frequently taught that the area of the hypogastrium, from the belly button down to the pubis, that area should be positioned outward according to some continental teachers. This is more associated with provincial German school than anything else. Actually, that is a misnomer which Miller and many others have refuted time and again. If you have any control of the hypogastric muscles, and I doubt that you do, but if you do, if you push out in the hypogastrium while you're taking a breath, you will find that you actually get a very small breath. The muscles in the hypogastrium do not connect into the inhalation musculature at all, and nothing can be helped by pushing down into the hypogastrium, as the Germans say, as though the woman is pushing out the baby, or for man it should feel like difficult defecation. There is absolutely no bearing, no relationship between great singing and difficult defecation or spitting out the baby. Anyone who would think of that is not a great singer. And I guarantee you no one sings with that kind of tension in those areas. There is no seeming end to the amusement of how people misunderstand the breathing setup and its connection to the larynx. One teacher here in my city is a very, very popular teacher, and no names, of course, and my intention is not to heap scorn upon this particular teacher, but to show the craziness about certain ideas about breathing. She teaches her students, female only, of course, that they should learn to sing with an open vagina. Now, the poor men are out of luck, of course, but this was a very interesting idea, supposing that the Kegel muscles, which control the vagina, are somehow attached to the inhalation muscles, which I guarantee you they are not. I told Richard Miller this story, and he, after laughing, said that perhaps the teacher could vend a set of stretching instruments to her students as she taught them. I risk censure here by this XXX demonstration, but see, there seems to be no end to the nonsense taught about singing, about breathing. In the primitive hominid where this new system was developed, the breath does much more than simply fill the lungs. The breath informs the musculature to place the larynx into the proper seat for noise making. So the first effect of the breath as it comes into the trachea is to establish a tracheal pull, a tracheal suction. Air coming through a tube forms suction. So as the air rushes into the trachea, it exerts a suction pull down on the larynx, which is suspended in a net of muscles, and it is not at all fixed. The larynx then lowers in the throat, and certain muscles pull down from the thyroid cartilage to the sternum. Certain muscles pull up as a suspensory mechanism. And the effect is that the larynx itself is opened and a new pocket of resonance is developed there. We now know it's the laryngeal ventricle, also known as the ventricle of Morgagni, if you're studying medicine. But it is the pocket between the true and false vocal cords, which is fairly collapsed in speech techniques, but which is opened up to a substantial ventricle when the larynx is lowered by this big rush of air. And so if I wish to tell my hominid group that there is a group of wild chimpanzees coming over the hill, a rush of air comes in first, lowers the larynx, opens up that pocket. That pocket then becomes an additional resonator and it resonates high frequencies and adds enormous intensity to the voice. That's the original way it worked. Now, when we've cultivated this in singing, it works exactly the same way in terms of augmenting tone. So breathing is not just there to fill up the lungs, it's there to set the larynx in the proper position and to open up the laryngeal ventricle. Now, the whole acoustical effect of that has been described by Sundberg and many others as the singer's formant. And when we get into vowels, we'll talk about that. But you see how everything is quite interrelated. Now, at first, the poor hapless singer is accustomed only to the experience of taking in a shallow breath and getting rid of it in a hurry. So we give him a few exercises to give him the experience of having a lot of air within the lungs in compression and releasing only a small amount. These were not invented by me. I took them from Miller, who's my major guide on most things. The first one is called sustaining the sibilant. So we take the proper breath close to the vital capacity, and then we release a very small S just so that the student can hear the release. There's nothing magic about the S. And we try to sustain release of the breath for 40 to 50 seconds. Now, immediately, most singers are out of air in a hurry because they're not accustomed to this. But after a while, they get the knack of it, and then they experience how the diaphragm and the intercostals, the inhalation setup, has to contract and act as a control valve to keep most of the air in the lungs while only that small S is released. Takes some people 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks sometimes. Other people get it in a hurry. The second exercise that I assign right away to give them the experience of this is the audible pant. The audible pant is not a doggy pant where you suck back in. It's not that. Instead, it's the same outgoing stream of air that we used in the sibilant, but now it's going to be punctuated by an H in a staccato rhythm of about. Now that's too big, but I wanted you to be able to hear it. The H is a puff, every H is a puff of air, and so the H's have to be very small. The goal for that is 30 seconds. So then this again acquaints the body with what we're asking it to do. In training the systems for singing, we do not work on the muscles directly because most of the muscles involved in singing are underneath the seat of consciousness. Therefore, we have to act on them indirectly with exercises which have been designed and tested to make the body understand what we're asking of it. So these kind of exercises then inform the body of what we're intending to do with the breath, which is different than the spoken breath. Likewise, as the breath informs the larynx and sets up a different laryngeal configuration, the tone is extraordinarily different than it is in speech. So the spoken tone, first of all, shows up with the larynx as having quite a leakage of air. If we look at the adduction of the vocal folds during normal speech, there's quite a gap, a good posterior chink, and a lot of air escapes quickly. That's one of the reasons we take a new breath after 2.5 seconds. in speech. But if we look at that same laryngeal shot when we set the larynx into the noise making or into the singing position, that posterior chink is closed. There is full complete adduction, and adduction levels continue to rise as we go up the scale. So before we go into the auditory effect of this breathing, I do try to allow the students to get a good sense of what it feels like to take the breath and not get rid of it. Rather, to take the breath and to hold it in the lungs comfortably by using the continued exertion of the inhalation muscles without any tension in the throat. It's not like holding your breath. Instead, the breath is held low by the diaphragm and the intercostals, and the throat is as relaxed as it was when you took the breath. I think that's a good summary of how I start with breathing, and I hope that'll give you some ideas. We wanted to do a little supplementary discussion on breathing for singing vis-a-vis speech. Slow inhalation does enable the student at first to begin to experience what the inhalation muscles feel like when they're working. That seems to be quite useful. And I mentioned before you could breathe either through the nose or the mouth, although the mouth is infinitely more preferable because of time and other factors. But I did mention that as you inhale, especially for young students, I try to get them to feel the temporomandibular joint on which the jaw hangs, and just to allow the jaw to open in a relaxed way as the breath comes in slowly, and to feel the suction and the pull as that happens within the base of the pharynx. That experience in the base of the pharynx and in the jaw, some people have used as an image the yawn. The yawn is fine for the first stage, but the yawn quickly moves to a second stage of stretch, which is not usable in singing. So instead of yawn, I tend to prefer Miller's image of a surprise or astonishment. I just got a check in the mail for $10,000 I wasn't expecting. Well, your jaw will open in a sort of a gobsmacked fashion there, and I have sometimes called it the idiot jaw, because it's not terribly flattering by itself, but it certainly does allow for good inhalation, and more than that, it allows for a connection to be made within the singer's experience between the deep breath and a relaxed jaw, which is essential for good phonation. So the muscles which open the jaw, there are essentially two sets of muscles which are interreactory in opening the jaw. The mylohyoids that form the floor of the mouth and connect to the jaw will contract whenever the jaw is open, and they connect into the hyoid muscles. So we don't want those muscles to be overreactive when we open the jaw, or it will pull up on the hyoid bone. So I try to give an image of keeping those muscles relaxed, almost like a frog with a bag of air, so that those muscles are not contracted much when we open the jaw. And the other muscles which are used if the jaw is opened in an aggressive fashion are the digastric muscles, and they form a loop-de-loop underneath the hyoid bone, and they will pull up on the hyoid bone if they're used in an aggressive way. So both of those muscles have to be trained out, and the relaxed jaw is what we substitute in for it. So how we inhale begins to not only fills the lungs for power supply, but it sets the larynx into the position of singing by the tracheal pull, which lowers the larynx, and then that tracheal pull informs the musculature. There again is this incredible tripartite organ which evolved in a balanced fashion so that the breathing system informs the phonatory system. The muscles of the cricothyroid, the sternothyroid muscles. I've got so many muscles there. The sternothyroid muscles insert into the thyroid cartilage and pull down to the sternum, Those muscles are key for phonation. They are keyed to contract. They are told to contract when that big breath comes in with establishing a tracheal pull. Okay? So the beginning understanding of balance in the system, which is critical, we begin with onset exercises so that the student learns that we do not have two events of breathing and singing. Instead, we try to get the student to experience what it feels like as the breath comes into the lungs, and to feel the lungs filling with air. And when the lungs are comfortably full, close to the vital capacity, then we want the tone to begin. So it's purely a matter of onset exercise so that we balance the process of breathing with phonation. So we have one event of breathe, sing, rather than two events of breathing, singing. Any separation within those two events, even milliseconds, can offset the balance. And the process works in balance. That's the way it evolved, so that we quickly could make a choice to make a sound, usually survival needs in our hominid ancestors. The concept of the need to make a sound activates the cortical control system in the right temporal lobe. The breath comes in quickly. The larynx is set quickly into noise-making position. The vocal tract assumes the position required for the particular sound we're going to imitate, and then the sound is produced. All of that happens very quickly. When we study it, we have to slow it down and look at the various parts of it. But the experience to the singer is quite quick. We take the breath, we coordinate the onset with the breath, and so the concept of the vowel and the breath create the onset. So there's no chance for local control of the organ, neither in the breathing, nor in the phonation, nor in the vocal tract shaping. So all attempts at local control of the organ will take it out of balance. It evolved in balance. It has to function in balance. And I think that brings us then into phonation from breathing.